Last week we had the incredible RAW update for the Canon C70. As soon as I got back from work on a shoot, I downloaded the update and I went out and filmed with it. I wanted to see straight away how good of an upgrade is this for the C70. I got back, looked at the footage, and I was blown away. The quality is absolutely incredible. People have been saying it's Alexa-like. There's extra detail in there and quality in there. And then I saw some comparison videos, comparing it to the XF AVC codec that we already had in the camera, and maybe I was just dreaming it all. Hello, my name is Jonathan Palfrey. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe as always, as it massively helps me out. Now, last week I downloaded the RAW update. I did a little film just around the harbour where I live, just to have initial impressions and to see how good is this new RAW codec. Now, this video isn't going to be a comparison between RAW and the compressed codecs. In fact, I'm going to do a whole separate video about that where I go into much more detail comparing every single codec that the Canon C70 can now shoot at all different resolutions. Instead, it's me giving my first impressions of this RAW update, what I really like about it, and will I use it in the future. Now make sure you hang around until the end because there is something I'm going to reveal which may surprise you about how I'm filming this video. So I think it makes sense that we start off by talking about what is it like actually shooting RAW on the C70. Well, the beauty is it's extremely simple. It's an internal RAW, there's no need for external devices like an Ninja 5, say if you were shooting with an FX3, which is fine, but I just find that really frustrating, and I always worry about the HDMI connection being knocked or anything like that and causing maybe a glitched file or even cutting out the recording completely. Obviously, internal RAW is nothing new, not even new to Canons, but what's really interesting here is a much more compressed RAW than we've had in the past, giving us different compression ratios and being able to fit it amazingly onto SD cards. While shooting, it's really quite simple. You have a choice between shooting ST or LT, so basically a standard or a light version of the RAW. There is an HQ RAW, however, this is only actually usable when shooting in the Super 16 crop mode in 2K. When it comes to the differences between ST and LT other than the bitrate, there are certain limitations. So ST can only shoot in normal frame rates, it can't go up to 50 and 60, whereas LT can. Personally, I just shot everything in LT because I think if I was going to use this RAW feature, I'd want to know that I can switch between the two without having to change the bitrate option all the time. I think that's just a bit too fiddly, a bit too annoying. I just want to be able to stick to pretty much one codec throughout my shoot. Of course, because it is RAW, you lose any sort of processing the camera might be doing. And this includes, unfortunately, things like digital IS. Now, of course, you can do post-IS as well, and it could be better or it could be worse. Sometimes it is nice to use that inbuilt digital IS that the Canon C70 has. It does certainly have its uses. It's not as good as in-body stabilization, but that's a whole story for another day. But it can be certainly useful. But when shooting in the RAW mode, you do not get that at all. Nor do you get any noise reduction either. Now, luckily, because of that DGO sensor on the Canon C70, the camera produces some really clean images already. So actually, this isn't really that much of a big deal. Now, the only other difference you'll notice while shooting is, of course, how much file space you have on your SD cards. When shooting RAW, a 128 gig card will give you 63 minutes when shooting LT, 41 minutes when shooting ST, compared to 106 minutes if you're shooting in the XF AVC-L. Now, this is where it gets interesting because actually if you're shooting XF AVC-I, you only get 41 minutes at 25 frames per second as well. So that means XAVC-I takes up just as much room as RAW ST. And that really does bring up some questions about the use of XAVC-I in the future. Interrupted by the cat. Okay, so now as we carry on this video, you'll notice there's a tail right here, and that's because my cat has decided to join me on this YouTube video, and I heard that cats in videos, especially by filmmakers, really helps get your views. From a Mr. Bloom, I've heard that before. Okay, now he's walking over on my MacBook. It's absolutely fine. Right, back to where we were. As soon as I got back, I had a quick look at the footage. I started editing, started grading and playing around with it. And the first thing I noticed with the raw footage compared to XF AVC-L especially is how smooth it ran on my 2020 MacBook Pro. So this is a pre-M1 chip MacBook Pro, and it ran so smoothly. The fan didn't even bother kicking up at all. It was editing very much like Blackmagic Raw actually on DaVinci Resolve. No real noticeable slowdowns, no real straining of the computer at all. And that's certainly one big advantage of going with RAW perhaps on this camera over shooting XF AVC-L. Now I mentioned this earlier, but when looking at the footage on the timeline, you really notice actually how clean the image still is. Despite the lack of noise reduction, you're not seeing some massive increase in noise like you often see with other cameras when you switch between a non-RAW and a RAW format. Here, the image still looks incredibly clean in fact, and that is thanks to that DGO sensor, which is obviously really working well. I personally would say you could get away with not actually putting any noise reduction in a lot of situations with this camera. The shadows stay pretty clean, and actually the bit of noise that is there does actually add a nice bit of grain and a bit of movement to the image. In RAW, the colours just seem to really look great straight away. All I did to get it into sort of a Rec. 709 look was to use the DaVinci Resolve Y colour gamut. But as soon as I turned that on, the footage looked absolutely awesome. And I could just tweak it slightly left and right just to dial it in exactly how I wanted it. There were a few shots that I definitely did slightly overexposed just to see, how well it would handle being pulled back down, and of course being RAW, it handled it perfectly fine. The C70 was already good at this, and I think RAW just makes it ever so slightly better. Similar in the shadows, I haven't really noticed any real issues. As I mentioned, it's not that noisy thanks to that sensor, and you can still lift those shadows quite nicely as well. I'll do more comparisons between the two, but perhaps what we're seeing here is that the shadows, because they're not being compressed as much, it just maybe gives you a little bit more latitude to work with, but it is slight. And I think that's probably the key takeaway from my initial impressions with this. Like, there is a difference, but it is very slight. It's little improvements that just kind of give you that feeling of a more organic looking image. It's not necessarily something you can easily measure in the same way that when we look at other cameras and we kind of say, well, why does that look better than that one? Often it isn't because of sort of technical specs. It's not because of, this one can be measurably better than the other one. It sometimes just comes down to a certain look. Same with lenses, it's a certain look that you like the look of, and it may not be perfect, or it may not be, what's classed as better in terms of a chart, but when you just watch the image and you look at the shots as you're going through, it just feels nicer and it just feels more filmic than before. And that's where I feel this Canon RAW sits in terms of a codec. Now, so with all that in mind, does that mean I'm going to be shooting RAW exclusively on this camera moving forward? Because for me, it felt like a big upgrade. And well, no, I'm not actually going to do that. The simple reason being is often you just don't need that RAW flexibility. Often it isn't going to come across in the final product that we're producing. Certainly there are situations, like when we're doing our resort shoots, for example, where I definitely will be using this RAW format. I think paired with the Blackmagic 6K Pro and its RAW, I think they're going to work really nicely together for different situations. Anything where really the budget is worthwhile, spending that bit longer with the color grade and being able to tweak it a bit more, or where I think that we'll need to do that, that's when I will definitely be shooting RAW to give us that extra flexibility. However, in the vast majority of shoots that we do, and I think the vast majority of shoots that most people would do with a Canon C70, the X-AVC-L is still more than good enough. It gives you 95, maybe 96, 97% of what Canon RAW from the C70 gives you. The big advantage of shooting XF AVC-L though is those file sizes. You're going to fit a lot more onto an SD card, which just makes things much easier when it comes to backing up at the end of the day. Shooting XAVCL also opens you up to things like 120 FPS as well, which can be really useful. And it's nice not to have to switch between different formats when wanting to go from 25, 50, 60 and up to 100 and 120. Now, if you're only doing everything in 25 or doing everything in 25 and 50, then yeah, you could shoot everything in RAW, of course. But I think if you may use the higher frame rates at certain times on a shoot, I think I would just stick to using XAVCL all the time. What about RAW ST on the camera? Well, I'm sure it's great, but for me, I don't really see where I would use it. The files are just bigger again, and although they're not massive, it's not ridiculous sizes. You know, certainly other cameras produce much bigger files than this does, and the C200, for example, used to produce huge RAW files, certainly much bigger than what this one is doing. But for me, I still don't really see much use for that. It is limited to 25 frames. As I was saying before, it just sort of limits you and you have to then switch formats if you want to shoot different frame rates. For me, there'd be very rare cases where I would feel ST is the appropriate codec of choice. And where does this leave XF-AVCI? You know, that was the top level quality format before on the Canon C70. And it was obviously the most easy to edit because of the all-eye codec versus the long op. Now, I'd have to say it sort of sits in a strange situation. The file sizes are quite big. They're as big as shooting ST RAW. I can't really see any advantage of shooting XF-AVCI over shooting RAW ST. RAW ST is going to probably give you better image quality. It's going to give you much more flexibility in terms of adjusting the image. It's going to be smaller file sizes as well. So why would you bother shooting XF-AVCI anymore? For me, that's the codec that has certainly been killed off in this RAW update. There are my initial impressions of the new Canon C70 RAW, and it is very impressive. I'm really excited it's been added to this camera. I'm really glad that Canon have sort of committed to the C70 and added it. Certainly with the announcement of the R5C and everything, it could feel that perhaps the C70 was going to be maybe left behind for more clever technology. But it's good to see that they are committing, at least for now, to providing some extra great features. At the start of the video, I did mention that you should watch through to the end. And the reason I said that is actually, in this video, the first half of the film, I actually shot using RAW. The second half, I used XF-AVCL. And I'm wondering if you noticed the difference between the two. Now, of course, you're watching this through compressed YouTube, but aren't we all doing that? I mean, let's be honest, most of the films that we're all producing on this camera is going to be shown online. Is there a noticeable quality difference between the two? Let me know in the comment section down below. I will be doing a full proper comparison of all the different codecs that the Canon C70 provides, so please make sure you subscribe for that. And once again, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.